Hello and welcome to Weather Snap. It's Friday, the 30th of June, the last day of June, and I'm Clare Nasir.
And my name's Alex Deakin. Welcome along. This week on Weather Snap, we are talking Canadian wildfires and Antarctic sea ice.
And also some numbers trickling down about this month's heat across the UK. More about that in a moment. But obviously, we've got today to play with as well. What's going to happen? Well, yeah, we'll talk about that in a moment. First of all, let's just talk about the monsoon. So every year we see the start of the monsoon at the beginning of June, and it lasts for a number of months. It's a proper celebration after the really intense heat of the springtime across India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Myanmar, and beyond as well. But it's been quite a slow start to the southwest monsoon this season, the 1st of June being the official start. But it has now started to intensify. In fact, according to the Indian Met Department, several Indian states will see some heavy, if not very heavy rainfall through the weekend and into next week. Now, the reason why there was a delay is something we've been talking about through the last week, and that's the cyclone Biparjoy, which moved up across the Arabian Sea, and it slowed down the progression of the onset of the monsoon. But we're picking it up now, and there's a lot of rain expected for the next few days, bringing relief certainly to much of India and its subcontinent in terms of it's been parched, it's been incredibly dry and incredibly hot, Alex.
Yeah, I mean, they rely on these rains, don't they? So it's absolutely essential that they get some. But every year, the monsoon is different. If it's a different start time, end time, but it intensifies at different parts of the country at different times. Earlier this week, some places recording 200 millimeters of rain in a day. And now we're looking at the next few days, particularly Bangladesh, Western Myanmar, daily rounds of these heavy showers, thunderstorms going to build up 600 millimeters, 400 to 600 millimeters building up in some areas. And by the weekends, the main focus for the heaviest rain is going to become more restricted to the west coast of India, the upslopes of the Himalayas as well. As you'd imagine, there'll be some heavy rain there. You know, varying amounts of totals from 75 to near 200 millimeters of rain. You know, that is a lot of rain still. I mean, it's not a lot in terms of monsoon rains because they're used to those kind of amount. Nothing exceptional, I should say, but it's still a lot of rain. You know, when you bear in mind parts of East Anglia and you see around 500 millimeters of rain in a year, and we're talking about 200 millimeters to maybe even 400 to 600 millimeters in a few days. So that's, you know, the same amount that you get in East Anglia in a year falling in a few days. But, you know, it is part of the monsoon. It is part of this cycle. But those kind of rainfall rates are still going to cause some problems. There will be flash floods and further river flooding is likely.
So I was digging a bit deeper into why it's now become active. Obviously, one of the reasons is because Biparjoy is now out of the way. It made landfall across the northwestern side of India. But looking at our global guidance unit discussion on this, they actually cite something called the SAM, which is actually in its active phase. Now, the SAM, we don't actually talk about very much here in the Northern Hemisphere because it stands for the Southern Annular Mode, southern being the operative word, because it's a set of westerly winds which are very powerful, which circumvent this Southern Hemisphere. And depending on the distribution of these winds and how strong they are and how they undulate, how they propagate, it can really intensify rains, not only across the Indian subcontinent, but also across Australia. And the Bureau of Meteorology have got a lot of information on the SAM because obviously it does impact their weather. So very interesting stuff. And it's something which actually, when I was talking to Ed Blockley earlier today, he in fact talked about it in terms of the growth of sea ice as well, Alex.
Yeah, I mean, they're all obviously going to be interlinked. It's such a big player, this SAM, this Southern Annular Mode across the Southern Hemisphere. Like you say, we don't talk about it very much here, obviously, but it is a big player in terms of global circulations. The Southern Annular Mode, this coupled climate systems, aren't they, that control the climate in the southern third of the world. That's kind of the best way of describing it. So they're going to have big impacts on things like the ice around the Antarctic. And as you said, that's what Dr. Ed Blockley talks about in his interview that he did with him earlier.
Dr. Ed Blockley, great to have you back on the show. First of all, just give us an overview of where we are at in terms of Antarctic sea ice, when the minimum is, when the maximum is, and where we are now.
So Antarctic sea ice extent generally reaches a maximum at the end of September and a minimum around the end of February. As of now, in the end of June, we're sort of roughly halfway through the growing season of Antarctic sea ice.
How do you measure the extent of Antarctic sea ice?
We have satellite records of Antarctic sea ice extent going back to 1979, and the sea ice extent is measured from the satellite by looking at the brightness of the ocean surface.
So why is it important that we monitor what's going on across the extremities of the southern hemisphere?
Sea ice is very much a barometer of changes in the climate system because it's very sensitive to increases in temperature because it has a clear sort of melting point. So when the ocean gets to a certain warmth, then sea ice doesn't form. At the same time, it's very important because it's white, and so it reflects a lot more of the sun's radiation back to space than does the ocean by itself.
Let's put this into perspective. We're talking about a huge amount of ice, which obviously will have impacts elsewhere across our climate. So give us a few numbers.
So Antarctic sea ice generally ranges from around about 2.5 million square kilometres at the summer minimum, and at the maximum it can be up to 20 million square kilometres. So the seasonal growth and melt of Antarctic sea ice is really quite huge.
You're saying we're around mid-season at the moment. Where are we actually this year in 2023?
The current Antarctic sea ice extent is around 11.8 million square kilometres, which is hugely below average, and in fact is around 1.3 million square kilometres below the next lowest recorded level, which was recorded last year.
So why has this happened, and what are the major concerns?
Antarctic sea ice has been very low now for a number of years. In February, we saw the lowest recorded minimum Antarctic sea ice extent, which was just a little bit lower than the record minimum that was recorded last year. And it has grown very slowly this year compared to normal. That anomaly has just increased during the season, particularly since the middle of May.
What's the driving force here?
Air temperatures around Antarctica have been really quite warm this summer. And also there have been some anomalous circulation patterns with the Amazon sea low being slightly off center, which is sort of driving more warm waters towards the Antarctic sea ice in some key regions.
Was this anticipated? Did it take scientists by surprise how low it actually still is?
The extent of Antarctic sea ice this year is phenomenally low, and I would say it's surprising. It's very much surprised me how low the Antarctic sea ice is, and particularly how slowly it has been growing, because it's the growing season right now heading towards the winter there. And so we would expect to have seen a lot more ice than we are currently observing.
So we are really looking with keen eyes for the next 2 to 3 months to see whether there's an uptick in growth.
Absolutely. There's still a lot more winter to go in the Antarctic, and the winter is always relatively cold because it's devoid of sunlight in the polar regions. So there still will be some growing happening of the sea ice, and there's the possibility that it can recover.
Ed Blockley, thank you very much. Really appreciate your time. Our thanks to Dr. Ed Blockley, who is the scientific manager of the Met Office's polar team. Now, a bit of a test for you here, Alex. I know you love a bit of a quiz.
Love a quiz,
Normally-
me. Only when I know
normally
the
we
answers,
quiz
though.
them. Right, so Ed talks about an absolutely huge number, and that's the maximum extent of Antarctic sea ice during its winter. And he talks about it in terms of 20 million square kilometers. And I think it's hard to fathom. What does that mean? I mean, how big is that? So in terms of countries,
Yeah.
how big are we talking? Equivalent.
Huge. Like you say, 20 million kilometers. But I mean, most people wouldn't, how big is Wales? That's often used as a comparison. But I give you a clue, it's a lot bigger than that, right? It's a lot bigger than Wales. China, how big is China?
Well, looking at my stats, it's 9,585,000,000 square kilometers.
9.5 million square kilometers.
9.5 square was
So less than half the size.
So 9.5 million square kilometers, yeah. And the US just pips it just above as well. So,
but not the biggest country. So the biggest country by land is Russia, right? 17 million kilometers square. So that even that is less than the extent of the Arctic sea ice.
So you can imagine that amount of ice covering the southern hemisphere must have an absolutely huge impact on our global climate. Hence the reason why so many scientists are concerned about it right now, because obviously we really need some regrowth through the second half of the winter as we sort of push through. Now, Dr. Ed Blockley said he was happy to come on this program again when he's got more numbers, but he's keeping a keen eye on it as well. So interesting stuff there. So let's go from the southern hemisphere to the northern hemisphere to good old Blighty, the UK.
We'll keep it on the numbers though, right? We'll keep it on the stats because people love that.
We do talk a lot about stats on this show, don't we?
Wow, yeah.
Who
doesn't love a stat? Who doesn't love a good weather stat? I mean, this month we lost RIP, my favourite weather stat of all time.
Do you know what? It was a sad day because 13th of June, it was your baby, wasn't it?
Well, I like to think so. I mean, it was really Dr. Mark McCarthy's baby because he came up with it. But that statistical anomaly, that the 13th of June, for those of you who are unaware, I mean, how could you possibly be unaware of this amazing stat? Until this year, the 13th of June was the only day during meteorological summer that hadn't reached 30 degrees Celsius. What a cool stat that was. This year, it's gone. It is no more. And I can only just talk about it now, almost 3 weeks later. I'm kind of coming to terms with it. But there is a new stat, only because I've been given a new stat about winter, but I'll save that for another time because it's too juicy just to give it all up and want it. But that's helped me get over this serious issue. But let's talk about the June stats as a whole, not just one specific day, because it has been very warm.
Okay, so the key thing is, right, we've still got a few hours to play with here. So they won't be properly released until next week. But 10 days ago, I know that the climate statisticians here in the Met Office, they were all pretty confident this was going to pan out to be the hottest June on record. And my goodness, I can't believe some of the numbers. They've absolutely smashed the last record.
Yeah, and this is, you say there's still time to go, but we've called it. The Met Office have called it a couple of days ago. This is the hottest June on record, and we don't make bold statements like that unless we're absolutely sure. The scientists in this building want to be doubly, triply sure, understandably, but we are so confident we've broken this record that we made that call. We put it out into the media as well. It has been the hottest June on record because we are so far ahead of the previous record. It has been such an exceptionally warm month that we know that when the stats come in, when we add them all up through the end of Friday, by Monday, as I say, that's when the official stats will be reached. We know that this will be the hottest June on record because we are currently running around about a whole degree above the previous record. And we are currently running, in terms of maximum temperatures, almost 4 degrees above the average. That's not above the record, that's above the average. And the mean temperature is around 2.5 degrees above the average. And even the minimum temperatures are a degree or so above the average. So we are above on pretty much every count, as you might imagine. What's really remarkable, it hasn't been any exceptional heat. Okay, we got to 32.2 on a couple of days. But we kind of get used to 30 degrees in June now because it happens more and more frequently. But there hasn't been any extended periods of exceptional heat. What we've seen through the month is we had the easterly to start with, right? So the East Coast was cold for the first week, but the West was already warmer than average. Yeah. And then we saw the switch in wind direction, southerly wind. The heat humidity has been building and temperatures have just been above average, significantly above average ever since. And even though we've seen a few thunderstorms, it hasn't really dampened the temperatures. Every now and then we've seen a bit of a dip. And even though the last few days have been around average, nothing to touch what we've seen just because we've had that consistent spell. There's a really interesting graph that we've been talking about. Talked about in the deep dive, the Met Office deep dive on Tuesday. So check that out on our YouTube channel. That talks all about the stats. And there's a really interesting graph that shows the plot that builds the aggregate average up over the time of June. And we are so far above that previous record and way above the average. It's been a sunnier than average month as well, going to be in the top 5, might even be in the top 3. And obviously it's been a drier than average month, although after an exceptionally dry start, it didn't rain for like the first 6 or 7 days anywhere almost. We have kind of caught up. We are now drier than average, but a long way above the driest. So really fascinating month.
And 25 degrees more than in excess of more than a fortnight, which is crazy. And this is before even the school holidays have broken up, although I know Scotland now are breaking up. But, this is a precursor to our summer. and so hotter than last June. And last June, look how the summer went. Not saying it's going to happen this time, but certainly there's a lot of heat in the ground already. And also we are surrounded by extraordinary warm seas as well.
Yeah.
Marine heat wave, which obviously does influence particularly coastal waters, coastal districts of the UK. So everything's there. And then we had this surge of humidity as well as everything else towards the end of that period of really dry and settled weather where we saw those thunderstorms. So that really injected more heat and energy into the atmosphere, hence the reason why we then saw a 32. So it's been, I've never known anything like it really. I'm talking about extremes. Let's talk about something else which has been in the skies across the UK for the last few days, if not a little bit longer. Let's just give a bit of context to that. We're talking obviously about the Canadian wildfires and the smoke, which really just engulfed much of the northeastern quadrant of North America. But looking at the news headlines, it's harrowing, really. It really is. Canada is experiencing some of the most destructive wildfires as a season on record, with hundreds of blades, a lot of them completely out of control, coast to coast as well, not just in one particular place. We talk about the Quebec wildfires, but they are pretty much dotted around the country and they are still blazing. That's the problem. So they're producing a huge amount of smoke and soot, which has been captured across many parts of North America, particularly the eastern side, on satellite imagery through the last few weeks, if not longer. Air pollution has been a real problem as well. Hazy skies, air quality alerts. And then because of the nature of where we get some of our weather from at times through the year, it's been picked up by the winds and the smoke has now just traveled across the Atlantic. And the smoke is now visible across the skies of the UK and beyond.
Yeah, we're talking this for a couple of weeks, if not longer. Remember, a couple of weeks ago, New York City was covered in that smoke, wasn't it? Big news. Now, we're not talking about that because that was quite low down. What's happened here is the smoke has been caught up higher up in the atmosphere, and that's drifted across the Atlantic because we've had more of an active jet stream, and our weather's been coming from the west. And that's something we picked up on satellite image again in the deep dive on YouTube on Tuesday, and it was mostly then across the Bay of Biscay. But since then we've had a weather front push north, draw the smoke up with it, and it was noticeable this morning here in Devon. Some of the guys in the ops center picked it up on their weather cameras. The veil of smoke came across at about 5 o'clock in the morning. So interestingly, people talk about smoke making sunsets more vivid, but that's not really true. What it does, it just kind of makes them a bit more atmospheric. It doesn't enhance the colors because the smoke particles are too big to scatter the light. So you don't get those enhanced colors. It just makes it a bit more atmospheric, a bit more moody, if you like. And that's what happened when, was it the Portuguese wildfires got drawn up by 2017, 18 by that storm Ophelia that came across and drew up. And then we had that very atmospheric again morning here. So it doesn't necessarily make those sunsets prettier. It just makes them a bit spookier almost. So yeah, look out for that over the next couple of days. I think it will be clearing away before the weekend, but certainly next couple of mornings and evenings as the sun sets, you get that more reflectivity of that smoky layer high up in the atmosphere. And it is high up.
It is high up, and obviously the rain is going to be cleaning a lot of the dust and the soot and the smoke out. And but there is a really interesting satellite picture on our Twitter feed, where we just point out where that is. You can actually recognize what's the cloud and what is the smoke. So that's right now. Alex, let's talk about July, the first few days of July, because there's been a real step change in our weather through the last 48 hours or so, well, a bit beyond that actually, but it feels a bit fresher, certainly. And obviously we do need the rain, and we're seeing some rain, especially across the northwest of Scotland, where a few weeks ago on the podcast, we were talking about water scarcity there. And now they are getting some sort of, as we talk about, moderate continuous rain, which is really good rain for just absorbing into the land. So what's happening?
Well, low pressure, basically. The jet stream shifted. So for most of June, the jet stream was up across Iceland, taking the lows up there. We were in the kind of southern portion of the jet to the south of it, where all the warm air is and the high pressure is, hence why we've had such a record-breaking June. The jet's been wiggling around over recent days. We've seen a few troughs, bringing weather fronts and bringing more atmospheric, less humid conditions. But now the jet stream's kind of more zonal, so it's more of a straight line, and it's almost a direct hit across the UK. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a grim weekend for most parts of the UK. Actually, the first couple of days of July look pretty good, bright and breezy, probably the best way to describe the weekend. But The low is going to sit just to the north of Scotland. And here, yes, some very strong winds for the time of year. Nothing exceptional, but unusually strong winds. And yes, some welcome but heavy and persistent rain over the Highlands through Saturday and Sunday. That rainfall total, even Monday as well, rainfall totals could really build up. So useful rain, yeah. Gusty winds as well. Not a weekend to be heading into the mountains over northern Scotland. You mentioned earlier the schools are broken up. So yeah, think of something else to do with the kids rather than head to the mountains this weekend in northern Scotland, because it is going to be unusually, unseasonably windy and also pretty wet. But most of the rest of the UK, first weekend in July, pretty good. Temperatures close to average, bright and breezy. Might catch a shower, but most places dry with sunny spells, and we'll have lost that humidity. So the nights will be a little bit more comfortable.
Good. So it's not really a day to be playing badminton in Kinloss then, would you say? Outside.
Is that what you're doing this weekend?
I just remember my childhood when it was windy, we couldn't play badminton outside, and the pathway was always the net, because obviously we didn't have a net, and the shuttlecock would go anywhere apart from towards your racket because it was too windy. So yeah,
there you go.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, I think last week we were talking to Aidan. He went to Pixie World or something like that.
Oh,
was
it was
his
Pixie.
event.
Was it Pixie Day in Ottery? Yes.
Pixie Day,
yeah.
that's
Pixie
right.
Day,
yeah.
That's one of Ottery's many quirks and slightly strange annual habits, along with the tar barrels. The Pixie Day is right up there. I'm not entirely sure what happens, but yeah,
we haven't heard a debrief yet about how Aidan got on
look
there.
forward to that.
Look forward to that. So that's it for Weather Snap. Alex, have a brilliant weekend.
Yes, thanks very much, and thanks to you for listening once more. It's been a great Weather Snap. Thank you very much, Claire, and we'll do it again next week, shall we? Another great Weather Snap, Claire. Thank you so much for listening. And don't forget to hit subscribe. Then you'll catch all of our daily weathers on YouTube as well.
And if podcasts are your thing, check out our Met Office podcast channel. Lots of information, lots of stories there. And we'll see you again next week.